Most Microsoft consultants are commoditized, not because they lack skill, because they sell the wrong thing. They sell execution, they sell hours, they sell apps and automations and migrations. They compete on delivery speed and cost, and they lose every single time to the consultant who understands what companies actually need. The highest paid Microsoft consultants in 2026 don't build anything. They architect control systems, they engineer governance, they reduce architectural entropy, and they charge $250 an hour, not $60, because they're not competing on technical skill. They're competing on risk mitigation. Here's the gap. Feature work pays $60 an hour. Entropy mitigation pays $250 an hour. A Power App costs $50K and takes 3 months. A governance remediation costs $150K and takes 12 weeks, and it prevents a $2 million breach. One is a project, the other is necessity. By the end of this, you'll have a framework for repositioning what you sell, how you price it, and how you acquire clients who will pay for governance instead of builds. This isn't about certifications. It's about understanding that companies don't have app problems. They have architectural decay, the architectural entropy problem. Most consultants miss the real problem because they're looking at the wrong layer. Architectural entropy is the proliferation of possible system states, configurations, and dependencies that make behavior unpredictable. It's not a feature problem. It's a structural problem, and it compounds silently until it costs millions. It manifests across 4 dimensions. State entropy, data inconsistencies, dual writes, permanent, temporary copies that nobody can remove. Configuration entropy, feature flags, settings, policies that drift over time until nobody remembers why they exist. Interaction entropy, service cascades, retry storms, dependencies that multiply faster than anyone can track. Organizational entropy, unclear ownership, distributed decision-making, teams operating in silos. Companies don't know they have an entropy problem until it costs them. A breach that takes 6 months to detect because identity governance never existed. An audit failure because access reviews were never automated. A failed migration that takes 18 months instead of 6 because the architecture was never designed for cloud. A compliance incident because data loss prevention policies were never enforced. By then, the debt is structural. It's not fixable with another app or another automation. This is where you come in, but only if you're positioned as the architect of control, not the builder of features. The consultant who sees entropy wins the contract. The one who sees we need a Power App loses to the lowest bidder. That's the fundamental distinction. One consultant diagnoses the disease, the other treats the symptom. Most organizations are operating in reactive mode. They solve yesterday's problems while entropy accumulates in the background. By the time leadership notices, through an audit failure, a breach, a failed migration, the problem is no longer technical, it's architectural. The system has too many possible states, too many configuration paths, too many undocumented dependencies, too many teams making independent decisions without shared governance. And here's what matters. They know this. CISOs know it, CFOs know it, chief risk officers know it, but most IT teams don't know how to articulate it. They don't have a language for it. They don't have a framework for measuring it. They don't have a path to fixing it. That's your opening. That's your positioning. You become the person who sees the entropy, quantifies it, and builds a remediation roadmap that actually works. The consultant who treats identity sprawl, Power Platform chaos, and Azure cost entropy as separate problems loses every time. The consultant who treats them as symptoms of one problem, architectural entropy across the entire Microsoft control plane, becomes indispensable. This is the shift from I build apps to I architect control systems. It's the difference between 80K annually and 100K plus, why companies are drowning in architectural debt. Understanding why organizations end up in this position requires looking at how they actually adopted cloud and Microsoft technologies. It wasn't strategic, it was reactive. Organizations adopted cloud, Microsoft 365, Azure Power Platform, without establishing control planes first. They didn't build identity governance before rolling out Entra ID. They didn't implement data loss prevention before enabling Power Platform. They didn't establish subscription governance before spinning up Azure resources. They just started using the tools. Each new tool added complexity without simplifying the underlying architecture. Copilot arrived, and suddenly there's AI interacting with sensitive data without governance. Agents launched, and nobody knows which autonomous systems have access to which resources. Fabric launched, and the data estate became even more fragmented. Every innovation added another layer of possible states without reducing the layers below it. Teams operate in silos. IT doesn't know what Power Platform is building. Security doesn't see the Entra ID drift accumulating in the background. Finance doesn't understand the Azure sprawl. Nobody owns the problem because everybody assumes someone else is managing it. The result is predictable. I've seen it hundreds of times. A financial services organization with Fund 200 direct role assignments when best practice is 50 to 100. 23 global administrators when the number should be 3 to 5. No privileged identity management, no access reviews, no lifecycle automation. Service principals with permanent credentials and no rotation schedule. 847 of them discovered in a single audit. A manufacturing company with 430 unmanaged Power Automate flows, 87 unmanaged Canvas apps, 0 data loss prevention policies, no environment tiering, citizen developers creating flows that export production data to personal OneDrive accounts without approval. Nobody knows it's happening until the data is accidentally shared externally. An enterprise with Azure subscriptions organized by department instead of governance model, inconsistent tagging, reserved instances that don't match actual usage, multi-region deployments without clear failover strategy, cost entropy building silently until the bill arrives and nobody can explain where the money went. These aren't edge cases, these are the norm. Most organizations have exceeded their entropy budget in at least one control plane, often all three. Most consultants treat these as separate problems. Hire a security consultant to fix identity, hire an automation consultant to fix Power Platform, hire a cloud architect to fix Azure. Each consultant solves their piece. The organization still has entropy because the underlying problem, unclear ownership, no lifecycle automation, no policy-driven access decisions, never gets addressed. The consultant who sees the pattern wins. The one who understands that Entra ID isn't just an identity provider, but a distributed decision engine making thousands of real-time authorization decisions. The one who understands that every accept clause in a conditional access policy converts a deterministic security model into a probabilistic one. The one who understands that Power Platform without governance creates collaboration entropy that compounds faster than IT can remediate it. That consultant becomes the architect of necessity. Not because they're smarter, because they're positioned differently. They're not competing on implementation speed. They're competing on the ability to reduce risk, enforce compliance, and prevent the architectural decay that costs millions. This is the repositioning that separates 80K consultants from 100K plus consultants. One builds features, the other architects control. One competes on hours, the other competes on outcomes. One loses to price, the other doesn't compete on price at all. The control plane model, to sell governance, you need to frame it in terms that executives understand. And that means understanding what a control plane actually is, and what it means when you exceed its entropy budget. A control plane is the set of systems, policies, and processes that enforce intent at scale. It's not a feature, it's the mechanism that makes behavior predictable and auditable. Microsoft has 3 primary control planes in 2026. Identity, Entra ID, productivity, Microsoft 365. Infrastructure, Azure. Each one has an entropy budget, the amount of complexity it can absorb before governance fails. Most organizations have exceeded their entropy budget in at least one plane, often all 3. Start with identity. Entra ID is not just an identity provider, that's the marketing term. Architecturally, it's a distributed decision engine making thousands of real-time authorization decisions every second. Every time a user signs in, every time a service requests access, every time an agent tries to use a resource, Entra is making a decision, allow or deny. Based on what policy? Here's where entropy enters. Every accept clause added to a conditional access policy converts a deterministic security model into a probabilistic one. You're delegating decisions you never revisited. A policy says require MFA for all users except, and then 6 months later, nobody remembers why that exception exists. It's still there, it's still creating risk, and it's still making the system less predictable. By the time you map the identity control plane in a typical enterprise, you find 200 direct role assignments that should be 50. You find 23 global administrators that should be 3. You find service principals with permanent credentials that should be time-bound. You find access reviews that were never automated. You find lifecycle automation that was never implemented. The control plane has collapsed into chaos. Move to productivity. Microsoft 365 creates collaboration entropy, unmanaged teams with sensitive data. Shadow data stores in SharePoint, uncontrolled co-pilot interactions with proprietary information. A citizen developer creates a flow in Power Automate that exports production data to a personal cloud storage account. Nobody approved it, nobody knows it exists, until it becomes a compliance incident. The productivity control plane is supposed to enforce what data can flow where, who can access what, and what happens when policies are violated. But most organizations never built that control plane. They just enabled the tools, and now they have 430 unmanaged flows with no data loss prevention policies, 87 unmanaged apps with no governance model, citizen developers empowered to build without guardrails. Then infrastructure. Azure is a sprawl generator. Subscriptions multiply. Resources are created without governance. Cost entropy builds silently. A team spins up a development environment and forgets to delete it. 6 months later, it's still running. Nobody owns it. Nobody monitors it. The bill arrives and nobody can explain where the money went. The infrastructure control plane is supposed to enforce consistent governance across all resources, consistent tagging, consistent access controls, consistent cost management, but most organizations never established that baseline. They just started using Azure, and now they have subscriptions organized by department instead of governance model, reserved instances that don't match actual usage. Multi-region deployments without clear failover strategy. Here's what matters. The consultant who understands these three planes as interconnected systems, not separate tools, becomes the architect of necessity. This is not about individual features. It's about how intent is enforced across the entire system, how decisions are made, how policies are applied, how behavior is audited. When you frame it this way, you're no longer competing on hourly rate or implementation speed. You're competing on the ability to reduce risk, enforce compliance, and prevent the architectural decay that costs millions. You're competing on necessity. A breach costs $2 million, an audit failure costs $500K in fines, a failed migration costs $1 million in rework, a governance remediation costs $150K and prevents all three. One is a project. The other is insurance. This is the positioning that commands premium pricing. Not because you're smarter, because you're solving a different problem. You're not building features, you're architecting control. And control is what keeps systems predictable, compliant, and secure at scale. The three-plane assessment framework. To position yourself as an architect, you need a diagnostic lens that reveals entropy. Most consultants don't have one. They walk into an organization and ask, what do you need built? The right question is, how much entropy are you carrying and where is it creating the most risk? The three-plane assessment is how you uncover the hidden problems that executives don't yet see. It's your diagnostic tool. It's also your first engagement, and it's paid work, not a free discovery call. Start with the identity plane. Map all identity types, human identities, service identities, agent identities, guest identities, measure role assignment drift, count how many direct role assignments exist versus how many should exist based on the organization's size and structure. Quantify privileged account creep, how many global administrators, how many service accounts with permanent credentials. Assess conditional access coverage. What percentage of sign-in events are evaluated by conditional access policies? What percentage bypass them entirely? When you run this assessment, you'll find patterns. Most organizations will have 40% or more of identities with excessive permissions, 60% or more of privileged accounts with no just-in-time controls, 80% or more of conditional access policies with except clauses that undermine security. These numbers are directional, but they're consistent across industries. Move to the productivity plane. Inventory, all collaboration tools. Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, Power Platform, measure shadow IT. How many apps exist that aren't governed? How many flows? How many Canvas apps? Assess data loss prevention coverage. What percentage of data flows are protected by DLP policies? What percentage move freely? Evaluate Copilot governance maturity. Are there policies controlling which data Copilot can access, or is Copilot accessing everything? Standard findings. 300 ungoverned flows. 50 unmanaged teams with sensitive data. Zero visibility into Copilot interactions with proprietary information. A citizen developer created a flow last month that exports customer data to a personal cloud storage account. Nobody approved it. Nobody knows it exists until it becomes a compliance incident. Then the infrastructure plane. Map subscription structure. Are subscriptions organized by business unit or by governance model? Measure governance consistency. Do all subscriptions have consistent tagging, consistent access controls, consistent cost management policies? Evaluate cost optimization maturity. Are reserved instances being used? Are they matching actual consumption? Assess disaster recovery readiness. Can the organization actually recover from a regional failure, or is it theoretical? Standard findings. Subscriptions organized by department, not governance. Inconsistent tagging across environments. Reserved instances that don't match actual usage. Multi-region deployments without clear failover strategy. A development environment was spun up 6 months ago and never deleted. It's still running. It's still costing money. Nobody owns it. Here's the critical part. The assessment itself becomes your first engagement. Not a free discovery call, not a 2-hour workshop. A paid diagnostic that costs $8K to $15K and takes 2 to 3 weeks. It delivers a 20-page risk report that shows exactly where the entropy is and what it's costing the organization. This report becomes your sales document for the remediation engagement. It becomes the justification for the investment. It becomes the baseline that makes your remediation work measurable. You can show before and after metrics. Role assignments reduced by 85%. Privileged accounts brought under just-in-time control. Compliance gaps closed. Audit findings eliminated. The assessment positions you as the expert who sees what others miss. It establishes credibility. It demonstrates that you understand their specific situation, not generic best practices. And it creates a clear path to the remediation engagement, which is where the real value lives and where the real money is made. Most consultants give away discovery. They compete on the free call. They hope to convert it to a project. The 100K consultant charges for discovery because discovery is work. It's valuable work. It's the work that justifies everything that comes after. Then client scenario A, identity entropy collapse. Let's ground this in a real scenario that shows how entropy compounds and how it becomes your entry point. A global financial services firm with 8,000 employees across 15 regions had grown through acquisition. Each acquisition brought its own Active Directory forest, its own intra-tenant configuration, its own identity governance model. By 2025, the organization had consolidated into a single tenant, but the entropy never got cleaned up. What they actually had: 1,200 direct role assignments when best practice is 50 to 100. 23 global administrators when the number should be 3 to 5. No privileged identity management, no access reviews, no lifecycle automation, security audit flagged 847 service principals with permanent credentials, and no rotation schedule. Nobody knew those service principals existed. Nobody knew what they had access to. Nobody knew when they were created or why. Then the breach happened. A compromised service account from an acquired company had access to core financial systems. The attacker used it for 6 months before detection. By the time the organization realized what happened, the damage was substantial. $2.3 million in forensics, remediation, and regulatory fines. The breach made the board meeting. The CEO had to notify regulators. The organization faced customer notification costs and reputational damage. But here's what matters. The breach wasn't the root cause. The breach was the symptom. The root cause was architectural entropy. The organization had 1,200 identities with excessive permissions, 847 service principals with permanent credentials, no automation to detect when a service account was being used inappropriately, no policies to revoke access when it wasn't needed, no lifecycle automation to retire service principals when projects ended. The organization realized the problem wasn't the breach, it was the architectural decay that made the breach possible. They engaged a consultant, not you yet, to implement Entra ID governance. That consultant built the features, access reviews, entitlement management, privilege identity management. The consultant implemented the tools. The organization still had entropy because the consultant didn't address the underlying problem. Unclear ownership, no lifecycle automation, no policy-driven access decisions. Enter you. You position this as an architectural entropy remediation engagement. You start with the assessment. Map all 1,200 role assignments. Identify which are legitimate and which are drift. Establish a baseline risk score. Document the current state in a 20-page report that shows exactly where the entropy is. Then the remediation phase. Implement lifecycle automation so access is provisioned from HR systems, not ad hoc tickets. Establish role-based access control with clear ownership so every role has a business justification. Enable just-in-time access for privileged roles so standing admin access doesn't exist. Automate access reviews with AI-driven recommendations so reviews complete in 2 weeks instead of 8. After 12 weeks, role assignments reduced to 180. That's an 85% reduction. Global admins reduced to 4. That's an 82% reduction. 100% of privileged access now time-bound. Access reviews automated and completing in 2 weeks instead of 8. Audit result, 0 findings related to identity governance. This engagement costs $120,000 to $180,000. It takes 12 weeks, but the value is measured in risk reduction, audit compliance, and incident prevention, not in the number of apps built. The organization avoided another breach. They passed their audit. They reduced their regulatory risk. This is the engagement model that generates $100K plus annually. This is what separates the commodity consultant from the architect of necessity. One consultant sees, we need to implement Entra ID governance. The other consultant sees, you have architectural entropy that's creating breach risk, audit risk, and compliance risk. I can quantify it, remediate it, and prevent the next incident. Same tools, different positioning, different pricing, different client acquisition strategy. Client scenario B, power platform, governance, chaos. Identity is one plane. Productivity entropy is equally destructive, and it's where most organizations are completely blind. A mid-market manufacturing company with 2,000 employees adopted Power Platform to empower citizen developers. The narrative was compelling. Business users could build apps without IT bottlenecks. Operations could create automations without waiting for custom development. Finance could build dashboards without hiring data analysts. The organization enabled the platform and stepped back. By 2025, they had 430 unmanaged flows, 87 unmanaged Canvas apps, 0 data loss prevention policies, no environment tiering, no solution management, no governance model. Citizen developers were creating flows that accessed sensitive manufacturing data without approval. Nobody knew what they were building. Nobody knew what data they were accessing. Nobody knew what could go wrong until it did. A citizen developer in operations created a flow that exported production schedules to a personal OneDrive. The flow ran every day. It exported the complete manufacturing schedule for the next quarter. When the data was accidentally shared externally, a misconfigured sharing setting, a forwarded email, a compromised account, the company faced compliance violations and customer notification costs. The breach exposed proprietary manufacturing data to competitors. The organization had to notify customers. They faced regulatory fines. The damage was substantial. But again, the breach wasn't the root cause. The root cause was architectural entropy. The organization had empowered citizen development without establishing governance. 430 flows with no approval process. 87 apps with no data classification. No policies controlling what data could flow where. No visibility into what citizen developers were building. They hired a consultant to set up Power Platform governance. That consultant created environments, set up DLP policies, trained admins on the Power Platform Admin Center. The organization still had entropy because 200 flows were already built without governance. Citizen developers didn't understand why their flows were being blocked. There was no clear policy for what was allowed and what wasn't, no ownership model for existing apps. The governance was imposed from above, not integrated into the development process. Enter you. You position this as Power Platform entropy remediation and governance maturity. You start with the assessment, inventory all 430 flows, classify them by risk level, critical, high, medium, low, identify which ones violate data classification policies, assess which ones should be retired. You discover 180 flows are duplicative or obsolete, 120 flows access sensitive data without proper controls. 80 flows are orphaned. Nobody knows who owns them. They're still running. They're still accessing data. Nobody's responsible for them. Then the remediation phase. Retire the obsolete flows. Establish environment tiering. So sandbox is for experimentation, development is for building, test is for validation, production is for live workloads. Implement data loss prevention policies that allow citizen developers to build but prevent data exfiltration. Establish a governance model with clear ownership and approval workflows. Automate compliance monitoring so violations are detected in real time. After 8 weeks, flow inventory reduced from 430 to 210. That's a 51% reduction. All remaining flows classified and governed. Citizen developers trained and empowered to build safely. Compliance monitoring automated. Cost $60,000 to $90,000 for the assessment and remediation. But this engagement often leads to a 6 to 12 month advisory retainer at $8,000 to $12,000 per month to maintain governance as citizen development continues. That's recurring revenue, not project revenue. Over 3 years, the retainer is worth $360,000 versus the project's one-time $60,000 to $90,000. This is where the real business model lives, not in one-time remediation projects, in ongoing advisory relationships that scale without proportional effort. This is how you transition from hourly billing to retainer-based recurring revenue. This is how you build a predictable, scalable consulting business that generates $100K plus annually without burning out. The consultant who sees Power Platform as a tool to build apps loses to the lowest bidder. The consultant who sees Power Platform as a governance problem that requires ongoing management becomes indispensable. Same platform, different positioning, different pricing, different business model. The pricing shift from projects to retainers. Once you understand how to position governance, the pricing model changes fundamentally. Most consultants price by the hour or by the project, $150 to $250 per hour, or $50,000 to $150,000 per project. This model commoditizes you because clients can compare your rate to others. They can shop, they can negotiate, they can find someone cheaper. You're competing on price because that's the only dimension that matters when the deliverable is generic. The 100K plus consultant prices by value and risk mitigation, not by hours or deliverables. The pricing model has 3 tiers, and each tier builds on the previous one. Assessment tier $8,000 to $15,000 for a 2 to 3 week diagnostic that uncovers entropy across one or more control planes. This is not a free discovery call. This is paid work that delivers a risk report and a remediation roadmap. You're charging for your expertise, your analysis, and your time. You're signaling that your knowledge is valuable. Clients understand this because the assessment is low risk and high value. They get a concrete deliverable. They understand exactly where their entropy is and what it's costing them. Remediation tier $80,000 to $200,000 depending on complexity and scope. Typically 8 to 16 weeks. This is where you implement the governance model, automate the controls, and establish the baseline. This is where you deliver measurable outcomes. Role assignments reduced by 85%, privileged accounts brought under just-in-time control, compliance gaps closed, audit findings eliminated. The client sees before and after metrics that justify the investment. Advisory retainer tier $8,000 to $15,000 per month for ongoing governance maturity, policy updates, and optimization. This is where the real money lives. Recurring revenue that scales without additional effort. A $10,000 per month retainer requires maybe 20 to 30 hours per month of your time. That's half an FTE, but it generates $120,000 annually in recurring revenue. With 3 to 4 retainers, you have $360,000 to $480,000 in recurring revenue. That means you only need to close 1 to 2 new remediation engagements per year to hit $500K plus annual revenue. This is the power of the retainer model. It creates a stable, predictable business. It aligns consultant incentives with client outcomes. If you're on a retainer, you want the governance to work well and stay stable. You don't want to create churn that requires constant rework. You're invested in the client's success, not in selling them the next project. Clients understand this model because it aligns with their business reality. Governance isn't a one-time project. It's an ongoing practice. As the organization grows, as new tools are adopted, as policies drift, as threats evolve, Governance requires continuous attention. The advisory retainer gives them access to expertise without having to hire full-time staff. They get a trusted advisor who understands their environment and their risk profile. The retainer also creates customer lock-in. Once a client has been on a retainer for 6 months or more, they're unlikely to switch. Switching costs are high. They'd have to find a new consultant, get them up to speed on the governance model, rebuild the relationship. This is why retainer clients are your most valuable customers. They're not one-time revenue. They're multi-year relationships that scale your business. The retainer also creates opportunities for upselling. As you work with the client, you'll identify new problems that require remediation work. A client on a $10,000 per month identity governance retainer might also need productivity governance or infrastructure optimization. You can propose follow-on remediation engagements that expand the scope and increase the overall relationship value. This is the pricing shift that separates 80K consultants from 100K plus consultants. One sells hours or deliverables, the other sells risk reduction and compliance assurance on an ongoing basis. One competes on cost, the other doesn't compete on cost at all. The pricing conversation never happens because the client understands that governance is a necessity, not a luxury. They're not asking, can we afford this? They're asking, can we afford not to do this? The positioning shift from builder to architect. Pricing is one dimension. Positioning is the other. And positioning determines whether clients see you as a commodity or as a necessity. Your LinkedIn profile, your website, and your pitch all need to reflect the shift from builder to architect. Most consultant profiles say something like, I implement Power Apps, Azure Solutions, Entra ID governance. This positions you as a builder competing on technical skill and delivery speed. You're in a race to the bottom with every other consultant who can code or configure. The 100K plus positioning says, I architect control systems that reduce architectural entropy and enforce governance at scale. This positions you as a strategist competing on risk reduction and business impact. You're not competing on technical skill. You're competing on whether the client's systems are predictable, compliant, and secure. Your case studies need to reflect this shift too. Most consultant case studies say, we built 12 Power Apps in 3 months, or we migrated 50 servers to Azure. This is a delivery story. It's about speed and volume. The 100K plus case study says we reduced identity risk by 85%, automated compliance, and prevented a $2 million breach. This is an outcome story. It's about risk mitigation and business value. Your speaking engagements need to shift as well. The commodity consultant speaks about Power Apps best practices or Azure governance frameworks. The 100K plus consultant speaks about why architectural entropy is the real cost of cloud adoption or how to measure and mitigate control plane drift. You're not teaching people how to use tools. You're teaching them how to think about governance as a strategic problem. Your content needs to shift too. The commodity consultant publishes tutorials on how to use tools. The 100K plus consultant publishes frameworks for thinking about governance, risk, and architectural necessity. You're not competing on technical knowledge. You're competing on strategic insight. This positioning shift is what allows you to command premium pricing. When you're positioned as a builder, you're competing against other builders on speed and cost. When you're positioned as an architect of necessity, you're competing against the cost of not having governance, and that cost is always higher than your fee. The positioning shift also changes who you sell to. Instead of selling to IT operations managers, you're selling to CISOs, CFOs, and chief risk officers. These buyers have bigger budgets, they have longer decision cycles, they have higher tolerance for consulting fees. They're not buying implementation, they're buying risk mitigation and compliance assurance. This is critical. The IT operations manager is asking, can we afford to hire this consultant? The CISO is asking, can we afford not to hire this consultant? One is a cost center, the other is a risk management investment. The conversation is completely different. Your positioning also determines how you talk about competitors. The commodity consultant compares themselves to other consultants. The 100K plus consultant compares themselves to the cost of inaction. You're not cheaper than the other guy. You're cheaper than a breach. You're cheaper than an audit failure. You're cheaper than a failed migration. This is the mindset shift that separates commodity consultants from architects of necessity. You're not selling hours. You're not selling deliverables. You're selling the prevention of architectural decay. You're selling the ability to keep systems predictable, compliant, and secure at scale. And that's worth whatever you charge because the alternative is exponentially more expensive. The client acquisition strategy inbound. Once you're positioned as an architect, inbound leads start to come naturally. You don't have to chase them. They come to you because you've articulated their problem better than they could articulate it themselves. Inbound client acquisition happens through thought leadership, content, and community presence. The mechanism is straightforward. You publish content about architectural entropy, governance frameworks, and control plane maturity. This content attracts IT architects and security leaders who are struggling with the same problems. They reach out to you because you've named the disease. You've given them language for what they're experiencing. You've shown them a path forward. The content types that work are specific. Long-form articles on architectural entropy and how it compounds over time. frameworks for assessing control plane maturity across identity, productivity, and infrastructure, case studies showing before and after metrics that prove the value of remediation, videos explaining why feature work is commoditized but governance is premium, LinkedIn posts that challenge conventional thinking about cloud adoption and governance. Distribution channels matter, but you don't need to be everywhere. You need to be authoritative in the niche of Microsoft architectural governance. LinkedIn is your primary channel because your target buyers, CISOs, IT directors, chief risk officers, are active there. Your strategy is straightforward. Post 2 to 3 times per week about architectural governance, identity entropy, control plane maturity, and the business case for governance. Engage with other architects and security leaders. Comment thoughtfully on their posts. Build relationships. Share your case studies and frameworks. Make them specific enough to be useful but abstract enough to be applicable across industries. The inbound mechanism takes 3 to 6 months to build momentum, but once it's working, it generates 30 to 50% of your pipeline. This is high-quality pipeline because the leads are already educated about the problem. They're actively seeking a solution. They've self-qualified by engaging with your content. Conversion rates on inbound leads are typically 20 to 30% because they're not cold prospects. They're warm prospects who already understand the value of governance. They've already decided they need to do something. They're just deciding who to hire. The sales process is shorter too. Cold outreach might take 12 weeks or more to move from first contact to signed engagement. Inbound leads often move from first conversation to assessment engagement in 4 to 6 weeks. They're already convinced of the problem. They just need to understand your specific approach and your pricing. Here's what matters. Inbound leads don't require you to be a salesperson. They require you to be a thought leader. You're not selling, you're educating, you're sharing frameworks, you're publishing case studies, you're building authority in a niche. The sales happen naturally because people reach out to you. This is also how you build defensibility. If you're the person who publishes the framework for measuring architectural entropy, you're the person everyone calls when they need to measure it. If you're the person who articulates why control plane governance matters, you're the person everyone calls when they need governance. You've made yourself the obvious choice. The content also compounds. A LinkedIn post you publish today might generate a lead 6 months from now. A framework you share might be referenced in an article someone writes next year. Your thought leadership becomes an asset that generates leads long after you've created it. This is why inbound is so valuable. The effort you put in upfront generates returns for years, but inbound takes time to build. You need to establish credibility. You need to publish consistently. You need to engage authentically. You need to build relationships with other architects and security leaders. This is a 3 to 6 month play before you see meaningful pipeline generation. Most consultants don't have the patience for it. They want leads immediately, so they do outbound instead. Outbound works faster, but it's also more exhausting. It requires constant prospecting, constant rejection, constant follow-up. The optimal strategy is to run both. Do outbound to generate immediate pipeline while you're building inbound. As inbound builds momentum, it gradually replaces outbound. By month 12, you might be 50-50. By month 18, inbound is generating more pipeline than outbound. By month 24, you're mostly inbound with selective outbound to fill gaps. This is the long-term play. You're building a business that generates leads without constant prospecting. You're building authority that makes you the obvious choice when someone needs governance remediation. You're building a moat around your consulting practice that competitors can't easily replicate. The client acquisition strategy, outbound. Inbound takes time to build. Outbound fills the pipeline while you're establishing thought leadership. Outbound acquisition is targeted, direct outreach to companies that have entropy signals. Entropy signals are indicators that a company is struggling with architectural decay, recent breaches, failed audits, migration delays, high cloud spend without corresponding value, rapid adoption of new tools without governance. These are all signals that the organization has exceeded its entropy budget somewhere. You find these signals through multiple channels. News monitoring for breach announcements and regulatory fines, LinkedIn research for company announcements about new cloud initiatives, industry reports from analyst firms tracking cloud adoption, direct research on company websites, earnings calls, and job postings. A company that's hiring 5 security engineers is dealing with a security problem. A company that's announcing a Copilot rollout is about to discover governance gaps. A company that's migrating to Azure is going to face cost and compliance challenges. The outbound approach is specific. Identify a target company with entropy signals. Research the CISO or IT director. Craft a personalized email that references their specific situation. The email doesn't pitch a solution. It asks a question that forces them to think about their control plane maturity. Example: I noticed your company announced a Microsoft 365 Copilot rollout last month. Most organizations deploying Copilot without first establishing data loss prevention governance end up with significant compliance risk. Have you established DLP policies for Copilot interactions with proprietary information? This email works because it's specific. It references their situation. It raises a concern they might not have considered. It's not salesy. It's consultative. It's asking a question that makes them think. Response rates on personalized outbound are typically 5 to 10%. From those responses, 20 to 30% convert to a discovery conversation. The math is straightforward. Send 100 personalized emails. Get 5 to 10 responses. Convert 1 to 3 of those to discovery conversations. The discovery conversation is where you pitch the assessment. I can spend 2 weeks understanding your identity, productivity, and infrastructure control planes and deliver a risk report that shows you exactly where your entropy is and what it's costing you. The assessment is $10,000 and takes 2 weeks. Most companies will say yes to this because it's low risk. Small investment, short timeline, high value. They get a risk report and a remediation roadmap. The assessment almost always leads to a remediation engagement because the report shows them problems they didn't know they had. You've quantified the entropy. You've shown them the risk. You've given them a roadmap. The decision to remediate is almost inevitable because the alternative is to leave the entropy in place and hope nothing bad happens. That's not a business decision. That's gambling. Outbound works best when you're targeting 20 to 30 companies per month, personalizing each email and following up systematically. This approach generates 2 to 4 discovery conversations per month. That converts to 1 assessment engagement and 0.3 to 0.5 remediation engagements. At 120,000 average remediation value, that's 40 to 60,000 per month in closed business from outbound. This is the foundation of a predictable pipeline while inbound is building. You're not dependent on inbound leads. You're generating your own pipeline through systematic outreach. You're not competing on price because you're reaching out to companies with specific problems. You're competing on your ability to diagnose and remediate those problems. The key to outbound is consistency and personalization. Generic emails get deleted, personalized emails get responses. You need to research each company, find the specific entropy signal, reference it in your email, ask a specific question. Make it about their situation, not about your services. You also need to follow up. Most people won't respond to the first email. Follow up after 1 week, follow up again after 2 weeks. After 3 touches, move on. But don't give up on the company. Revisit them in 3 months. Something will have changed. A new announcement, a new hire, a new entropy signal. Your persistence will eventually connect. The combination of inbound and outbound creates a diversified pipeline. Inbound generates high-quality warm leads that convert quickly. Outbound generates volume and fills gaps while inbound is building. Together, they create a predictable, scalable client acquisition engine that generates consistent pipeline month after month. The assessment, a sales tool. The assessment is not just a diagnostic, it's your most powerful sales tool. And most consultants completely misunderstand this. Most consultants give away discovery. They offer a free assessment or a 2-hour discovery call. They think this builds trust. It doesn't. It signals that your expertise isn't valuable enough to charge for. Free discovery attracts tire kickers and budget-constrained prospects. Paid discovery attracts serious buyers who understand that diagnosis costs money. Paid assessments signal 3 things. First, that you're serious. You're not desperate for work. You're selective about who you work with. Second, that your time is valuable. You're not giving away analysis that took years to develop. Third, that the output will be worth the investment. You're not doing a generic assessment. You're doing a specific diagnostic tailored to their environment. The assessment costs $8,000 to $15,000 and takes 2 to 3 weeks. It's scoped to 1 or more control planes. Identity governance, productivity governance, infrastructure governance. The output is a 20 to 30-page risk report with current state analysis, entropy quantification, risk scoring, compliance gaps, and a remediation roadmap. Here's what makes it work. The assessment is designed to uncover problems the client didn't know they had. If the assessment only confirms what they already know, it won't drive a remediation engagement. You need to find the hidden entropy, the drift that's accumulated over years, the policies that are no longer enforced, the orphaned resources creating risk, the service accounts with permanent credentials, the unmanaged flows accessing sensitive data, the Azure subscriptions nobody owns. The assessment establishes you as the expert who understands their specific situation. By the time you present the report, the client has already decided you're the right person to fix the problem. The remediation engagement is almost a foregone conclusion. You've diagnosed the disease, you've shown them the cost, you've given them a roadmap. The decision to remediate is inevitable because the alternative is to leave the entropy in place. The assessment also creates a baseline that makes the remediation work measurable. You can show before and after metrics, role assignments reduced by 85%, privileged accounts brought under just-in-time control, compliance gaps closed, flow inventory reduced by 50%. These metrics are what justify the remediation investment to the CFO and the board. You're not asking them to trust you. You're showing them measurable outcomes. The assessment should be structured to take 2 to 3 weeks of work, not 8 weeks. You're not doing the full remediation in the assessment. You're doing enough work to understand the problem and recommend a solution. The remediation is where the real work happens and where the real value is captured. Think about the assessment as the sales conversation that happens on paper. You're asking questions, you're analyzing responses, you're quantifying risk, you're presenting findings, you're recommending next steps. By the time the client finishes reading the report, they understand exactly what's wrong, why it matters, and what needs to happen next. The pricing of the assessment is also strategic. 8 to 15,000 is enough to signal seriousness, but not so much that it's a barrier to entry. Most companies with entropy problems can justify 8 to 15,000 for a diagnostic. They can't justify 120,000 for remediation without first understanding the problem. The assessment gets you in the door. The remediation is where you capture the real value. The assessment also creates a natural upsell path. Once you've completed the identity plane assessment, the client often wants to address the productivity plane or the infrastructure plane. One assessment often leads to 2 or 3 follow-on assessments. Each one expands the relationship. Each one identifies new remediation opportunities. By the time you're done with assessments, you've got a clear roadmap for multiple remediation engagements that will occupy you for the next year. This is how you build a predictable, scalable consulting business. Assessments lead to remediation. Remediation leads to advisory retainers. Advisory retainers lead to follow-on remediation. Each engagement expands the relationship. Each one increases the lifetime value of the client. Each one makes you more indispensable because you understand their environment better than anyone else. The assessment is the bridge between positioning and pricing. It's how you move from being a commodity consultant to being an architect of necessity. It's how you demonstrate value before asking for the big investment. It's how you make the case that governance isn't a cost. It's insurance against catastrophic failure. The remediation engagement, scope and delivery. Once the assessment is sold, the remediation engagement is where you deliver measurable value. This is where you move from diagnosis to treatment, and it's where you prove that governance isn't theoretical, it's operational. The remediation engagement is typically 8 to 16 weeks and costs $80,000 to $200,000 depending on scope and complexity. It's structured in phases. Planning takes weeks 1 and 2. Implementation takes weeks 3 through 12. Optimization takes weeks 13 through 16. Planning phase is critical. You finalize the remediation roadmap. You establish governance models. You define ownership and approval workflows. You set up the technical environment. You're not building yet. You're planning, you're getting alignment, you're making sure everyone understands what's happening and why it matters. This is where you prevent scope creep. This is where you establish clear success criteria. Implementation phase is where the real work happens. You deploy the controls. For identity, that means conditional access policies, data loss prevention rules, lifecycle automation, access reviews. For productivity, that means environment tiering, DLP policies, governance models. For infrastructure, that means subscription organization, tagging standards, cost management policies. You're not just configuring tools, you're building systems that enforce policy at scale. Migration is part of implementation. You migrate existing configurations to the new model. You move role assignments from direct to role-based. You migrate flows from unmanaged to governed environments. You move subscriptions from ad hoc organization to governance-based structure. Migration is the risky part. It's where things can break. It's where you need careful planning and extensive testing. Training happens during implementation too. Admins need to understand the new governance model. Users need to understand why policies exist. Citizen developers need to understand how to build within guardrails. Training is how you prevent the new governance from being circumvented. If people don't understand why a policy exists, they'll find ways around it. If they understand the business case, they'll work within it. Optimization phase is weeks 13 through 16. You monitor and refine the controls. So you address edge cases. You establish ongoing governance processes. You're not done when implementation is complete. You're done when the governance is stable and sustainable, when admins can operate it without your help, when the organization has the skills to maintain it. The key to a successful remediation is clear ownership and decision-making authority. You need a sponsor, usually the CISO or IT director, who has budget authority and can make decisions quickly. You need a working group with identity architect, security engineer, and compliance officer who can provide input and execute the technical work. You need executive alignment on what success looks like. The remediation should be delivered by you with heavy involvement from the client's team. This is not a we'll do it and hand it off engagement. It's a we'll do it together engagement. The client's team does half the work. You guide and oversee. This approach builds client capability so they can maintain the governance after you're gone. It also creates accountability. The client's team is invested in the success of the remediation. The remediation should produce measurable outcomes. Role assignments reduced. Privileged accounts brought under control, compliance gaps closed, audit readiness improved. These outcomes should be documented and presented to the CFO and board. This is what justifies the investment. This is what creates the foundation for the advisory retainer. The remediation also creates opportunities for upselling. Once you've fixed identity governance, you can remediate productivity or infrastructure governance. Most organizations need work across all 3 planes. So the initial remediation often leads to 2 or 3 follow-on engagements. Each one expands the relationship. Each one increases the lifetime value of the client. This is the engagement model that generates consistent revenue. Assessments at 8 to 15,000, remediation at 80 to 200,000, advisory retainers at 8 to 15,000 monthly. Each client generates 50 to 300,000 annually in revenue across all three tiers. With 3 to 5 clients, you're at 150,000 to 1.5 million in annual revenue. The remediation engagement is where you prove your value. It's where you show that governance isn't a cost. It's a risk management investment that prevents catastrophic failure. It's where you demonstrate that you're not just an implementer, you're an architect who understands how systems work at scale. The advisory retainer, building recurring revenue. The remediation is one-time revenue. The advisory retainer is recurring revenue that scales your business without proportional effort. The advisory retainer is typically 8,000 to 15,000 per month and is structured as an ongoing engagement. It includes quarterly governance reviews where you assess the current state of the control planes and identify drift. Policy updates as the organization adopts new tools or faces new threats. Optimization recommendations to improve efficiency and reduce cost. Emerging threat monitoring to stay ahead of new attack vectors. And access to you for questions and escalations when governance issues arise. The retainer is sold at the end of the remediation engagement. The pitch is straightforward. We've built this governance model and established the baseline. To keep it working and evolving, we recommend an ongoing advisory engagement. Most clients will say yes because they understand that governance isn't a one-time project, it's an ongoing practice. As the organization grows, as new tools are adopted, as policies drift, as threats evolve, governance requires continuous attention. The retainer is attractive to clients because it gives them predictable access to expertise without having to hire full-time staff. They get a trusted advisor who understands their environment and their risk profile. They get someone who knows where the entropy is and how to prevent it from accumulating. They get peace of mind knowing that governance is being actively managed, not just implemented and forgotten. For you, the retainer is valuable because it's recurring revenue that scales without proportional effort. A $10,000 per month retainer requires maybe 20 to 30 hours per month of your time. That's half an FTE, but it generates $120,000 annually in recurring revenue. With 3 to 4 retainers, you have $360,000 to $480,000 in recurring revenue. That means you only need to close 1 to 2 new remediation engagements per year to hit $500K plus annual revenue. This is the power of the retainer model. It creates a stable, predictable business. The revenue is predictable. The workload is predictable. You're not dependent on constant prospecting and closing. You've got a base of recurring revenue that pays the bills and funds your business growth. The retainer also aligns consultant incentives with client outcomes. If you're on a retainer, you want the governance to work well and stay stable. You don't want to create churn that requires constant rework. You're invested in the client's success, not in selling them the next project. This is different from the project model where you might be incentivized to create problems so you can sell solutions. The retainer also creates customer lock-in. Once a client has been on a retainer for 6 months or more, they're unlikely to switch. Switching costs are high. They'd have to find a new consultant, get them up to speed on the governance model, rebuild the relationship. This is why retainer clients are your most valuable customers. They're not one-time revenue. They're multi-year relationships that scale your business. The retainer also creates opportunities for upselling. As you work with the client, you'll identify new problems that require remediation work. A client on a $10,000 per month identity governance retainer might also need productivity governance or infrastructure optimization. You can propose follow-on remediation engagements that expand the scope and increase the overall relationship value. The retainer is also how you build defensibility. If you're the person managing a client's governance, you're the person they call when something breaks. You're the person they trust with their risk management. You've made yourself indispensable because you understand their environment better than anyone else. This is the business model that generates sustainable, scalable revenue. Assessments generate initial engagement. Remediation generates substantial upfront revenue and establishes credibility. Advisory retainers generate predictable recurring revenue that funds the business and allows you to be selective about new projects. By year 2 or 3, most of your revenue comes from retainers. You're no longer dependent on closing new projects every month. You've got a base of recurring revenue that's stable and predictable. You're running a business, not trading time for money. Positioning against competitors. You're not competing against other consultants. You're competing against the cost of inaction. Most of your competitors are positioned as builders or implementers. They sell hours, projects, or deliverables. They compete on speed, cost, and delivery quality. They're racing to the bottom because that's the only dimension that matters when the deliverable is generic. A client comparing your $50,000 remediation to another consultant's $30,000 remediation is making the wrong comparison. The real comparison is what's the cost of not having governance. If a breach costs $2 million, a failed audit costs $500,000 in fines, or a failed migration costs $1 million in rework, then $150,000 for governance remediation is a bargain. Your job in the sales process is to make this comparison explicit. You quantify the cost of entropy. You say it clearly. Your current identity governance posture creates a breach risk of $2 million or more. Our remediation costs $150,000 and reduces that risk by 85%. This is how you position against lower-cost competitors. You're not more expensive, you're more valuable, you're not charging more for the same work, you're charging appropriately for work that prevents catastrophic failure. You're also positioned differently from the big consulting firms, Deloitte, Accenture, McKinsey. These firms are generalists who sell broad transformation programs. You're a specialist who focuses on architectural governance in the Microsoft ecosystem. Specialists are more valuable than generalists for specific problems because they have deeper expertise and faster execution. A client with a specific identity governance problem would rather hire a specialist than pay a generalist $500 per hour to learn the domain. Specialists also move faster. You know the Microsoft ecosystem. You know the tools. You know the patterns. You know what works and what doesn't. A generalist is learning as they go. A specialist is executing from experience. This speed difference is worth money to the client. It means faster remediation, faster time to value, faster risk reduction. You're also positioned differently from the Microsoft partners. Microsoft partners are incentivized to sell Microsoft licenses and services. You're incentivized to help the client optimize their existing Microsoft investments. This creates a natural differentiation. You're the trusted advisor who helps them get value from what they've already bought, not the vendor trying to sell them more. Partners also have conflicts of interest. If a partner recommends a solution that requires buying more licenses, are they recommending it because it's the best solution or because it generates revenue? You don't have that conflict. You're recommending what's best for the client. You're not making money if they buy more licenses. You're making money if their governance improves and their risk decreases. This positioning also changes how you talk about your competitors. You don't compare yourself to other consultants. You don't say, I'm cheaper than that guy or I'm faster than that firm. You compare yourself to the cost of inaction. You say, the cost of not having governance is exponentially higher than the cost of implementing it. Your positioning also determines your pricing power. When you're positioned as a builder, you're competing against other builders on speed and cost. When you're positioned as an architect of necessity, you're competing against the cost of inaction. The conversation is completely different. The client isn't asking, can we afford this? They're asking, can we afford not to do this? This is the positioning that generates premium pricing. This is the positioning that makes you indispensable. This is the positioning that separates commodity consultants from architects of necessity. The pricing negotiation. When to hold, when to bend. Pricing is a negotiation. You need principles for when to hold firm and when to be flexible. Without principles, you'll discount yourself into poverty. With the wrong principles, you'll price yourself out of deals. Your baseline pricing is $8,000 to $15,000 for assessments, $80,000 to $200,000 for remediation, and $8,000 to $15,000 per month for retainers. This pricing is not arbitrary. It's based on the value you deliver. But pricing is also contextual. A $500 million enterprise with 10,000 employees has a different risk profile than a $50 million company with 1,000 employees. Your pricing should scale with the scope and complexity. For large enterprises with high complexity, price at the top of your range. 15,000 assessments, 200,000 remediation, 15,000 monthly retainers. These organizations have substantial budgets. They have regulatory requirements. They have complex environments. The entropy they're dealing with is correspondingly complex. The risk is higher. The value of remediation is higher. Price accordingly. For mid-market companies with moderate complexity, price in the middle. 10,000 to 12,000 assessments, 120,000 to 150,000 remediation. 10,000 to 12,000 monthly retainers. These organizations have meaningful budgets but tighter constraints than enterprises. They have compliance requirements but not the regulatory intensity of financial services or healthcare. Price in the middle. For smaller companies with lower complexity, price at the bottom. 8,000 to 10,000 assessments, 80,000 to 100,000 remediation, 8,000 to 10,000 monthly retainers. These organizations have smaller budgets. They have fewer compliance requirements. Their environments are less complex. Price accordingly. The key principle: never discount based on the client's budget constraints. If a client says, we can only afford 60,000 for remediation, the answer is not, okay, I'll do it for 60,000. That's how you end up under-delivering and overworking. The answer is, that scope won't work for 60,000. Let's reduce the scope to fit the budget, or let's phase the engagement over time so you can spread the cost. This maintains your pricing integrity. It ensures you're not under-delivering. It ensures you're not burning out on low-margin work. It also signals to the client that you're serious about your pricing. You're not desperate. You're not willing to work for less. This actually increases their respect for you. However, there are situations where you should be flexible. If a client is in a regulated industry with high compliance risk, you can justify premium pricing. Top of range, they have more to lose. If a client is a nonprofit or government agency with genuine budget constraints, you can offer a modest discount, 10 to 15% in exchange for a longer engagement or a retainer commitment. You're not discounting because they're broke. You're adjusting price in exchange for something valuable to you. If a client is a good cultural fit and has potential for multi-year, multi-plane remediation, you can offer a package discount. Bundle assessment plus remediation plus retainer for 10 to 15% off. You're discounting because the lifetime value is high. You're betting on a long-term relationship that will generate substantial revenue. The principle, discounts are okay if they're tied to value or relationship duration, not to the client's budget constraints. Another principle, always position the price in terms of value, not cost. Don't say the assessment costs $10,000. Say the assessment costs $10,000 and typically identifies $500,000 to $1 million in risk that needs to be addressed. Most clients recover the cost of the assessment in the first month of remediation. This reframes the price as an investment with a clear return. Pricing also signals quality. Premium pricing signals that you're the best, that you have high standards, and that you're selective about who you work with. Low pricing signals that you're a commodity and that you're desperate for work. Hold your pricing with confidence. The clients who are serious about governance will pay it. The clients who are shopping on price aren't your clients anyway. Building a team, when to hire. At some point, you'll have more work than you can do alone. This is when you need to build a team. And most consultants get this timing wrong. The first hire is typically a junior consultant or engineer who can handle implementation work under your supervision. This person allows you to take on larger remediation engagements and frees you up to focus on sales and strategy. You're not hiring because you're overworked. You're hiring because you have a pipeline of work that justifies the investment. You should hire when you have 2 to 3 months of backlogged work, not when you're fully booked. If you wait until you're fully booked, you'll be stretched thin and won't have time to sell. You'll be so focused on delivery that you'll miss the next opportunity. If you hire too early, you'll have bench time and wasted payroll. The ideal timing is when you have a pipeline of work that would keep the person 60 to 70% utilized. That gives you room for training and ramp up without wasting money on idle capacity. The second hire is typically a subject matter expert in one of the control planes, an identity architect, a security engineer, a data governance specialist. This person brings deep expertise that allows you to take on more complex engagements and command higher pricing. You're not hiring another generalist. You're hiring a specialist who can handle the hard problems while you focus on client relationships and strategy. The third hire is typically a business operations person who handles sales proposals and delivery management. This person frees you up to focus on the technical and strategic work. You're no longer spending time on admin. You're not writing proposals. You're not managing schedules. You're focusing on the work that generates the most value. As you grow, you'll need to decide on your business model. Stay as a solo consultant, build a small boutique firm with 5 to 10 people. Or scale to a larger firm with 20 or more people. The solo consultant model is the most profitable in terms of margins, 70 to 80%, but has a ceiling on revenue. You can probably generate 300 to 500,000 annually working alone. You're constrained by your own capacity. You can only take on so many clients. You can only work so many hours. The boutique firm model with 5 to 10 people has lower margins, 40 to 50%, but higher revenue potential, 1 to 3 million annually. You've got leverage, you've got team capacity, you can take on larger engagements, you can serve more clients. You're building a business that's bigger than yourself. The larger firm model with 20 or more people has even lower margins, 20 to 30%, but much higher revenue potential. 5 million or more annually, you're running a full-service consulting firm. You've got multiple service lines, you've got geographic reach, you've got the ability to serve enterprise clients with complex multi-year engagements. The choice depends on your goals. If you want to maximize personal income, stay solo or build a small boutique. If you want to build a scalable business that can be sold or scaled further, invest in building a team and systems. The key principle, hire for leverage, not to reduce your workload. Each hire should allow you to take on more valuable work, not just reduce your hours. A junior consultant should allow you to take on 2 to 3 times more remediation work. A subject matter expert should allow you to take on more complex engagements that command higher pricing. A business operations person should allow you to focus on the work that generates the most value. This is the difference between hiring to reduce stress and hiring to scale. One is tactical, the other is strategic. You're not hiring because you're tired. You're hiring because you've identified leverage that will increase your revenue and impact. Specialization versus generalization, the strategic choice. As you grow, you'll face a choice that determines the trajectory of your business. Go deeper in one domain or broader across domains. This is the specialization versus generalization question, and it has profound implications for your positioning, pricing, and market opportunity. The specialist path means you focus on one control plane and become the world's expert in that domain. Identity governance, for example. You know Entra ID inside and out. You understand every nuance of conditional access. You can architect complex access models that others can't. You command premium pricing for identity work because there are fewer specialists than generalists. Specialists have less competition because there are fewer people willing to go deep enough to become world-class in one domain. Most consultants stay generalists because it feels safer. Broader market, more opportunities, less risk of market saturation. But that safety comes at a cost. You're competing against everyone else who's also a generalist. You're competing on price because you're not differentiated. The specialist path also gives you deeper expertise and faster execution. You've solved identity governance problems 100 times. You know what works, you know what doesn't. You know the edge cases, you know the gotchas. A generalist is learning as they go. A specialist is executing from experience. This speed difference is worth money to the client. It means faster remediation, faster time to value, faster risk reduction. The downside of specialization is that you have a smaller addressable market. You're dependent on one domain. If identity governance becomes commoditized or if the market shifts, you're vulnerable. You've built your entire business around one thing. If that thing changes, you have to change with it. The generalist path means you offer comprehensive governance across all control planes. Identity, productivity, infrastructure. You can help clients with any governance problem. You have a larger addressable market because you can serve clients with any governance need. You have more opportunities for upselling because you can fix identity, then sell productivity, then sell infrastructure. The downside of generalization is that you're competing against specialists in each domain and you're less differentiated. You need deeper expertise across multiple domains, which is harder to build. You're a mile wide and an inch deep. Specialists are an inch wide and a mile deep. Clients with specific problems prefer the specialist. The optimal path for most consultants is specialist with adjacent expertise. You specialize in one control plane, identity governance, for example, and develop adjacent expertise in the others. This allows you to be the expert in your primary domain while also being able to handle related work. Your primary expertise is identity governance, but you understand how identity connects to productivity governance through Copilot access control and infrastructure governance through Azure RBAC. This positioning allows you to be the primary consultant for identity work while also being a trusted advisor for broader governance questions. As you grow, you can hire specialists in the adjacent domains and position yourself as the orchestrator of comprehensive governance. This is the path that leads to a million-plus business. You become known for one domain. You build a team of specialists in other domains. You position yourself as the architect who brings it all together. The client's primary relationship is with you. You understand their business. You understand their risk profile. You coordinate the specialists. You ensure consistency across all control planes. This is also how you build defensibility. If you're the identity governance expert in the Microsoft ecosystem, you're the obvious choice when someone needs identity work. If you've built a team of specialists in other domains, you're also the obvious choice for comprehensive governance. You've made yourself indispensable because you're the only person who understands all the pieces and how they fit together. The specialist with adjacent expertise path also allows you to scale without losing focus. You're not trying to be everything to everyone. You're the expert in one domain. You're the coordinator of comprehensive governance. You're the architect who understands how systems work at scale. This is the positioning that generates sustainable, scalable revenue. This is the positioning that allows you to command premium pricing. This is the positioning that separates commodity consultants from architects of necessity. The 12-month plan to 100K plus. Let's put this all together into a concrete plan for the next 12 months. This is how you move from commodity consultant to architect of necessity. This is how you build a business that generates consistent premium revenue. Months 1 and 2, positioning and content foundation. Start by rewriting your LinkedIn profile. Remove the builder language. Replace it with architect language. You're not implementing Power Apps and Azure solutions. You're architecting control systems that reduce architectural entropy and enforce governance at scale. Your headline isn't about tools, it's about outcomes. Your About section isn't about your certifications, it's about the problems you solve and the frameworks you've developed. Create a 10-point framework for assessing control plane maturity. This is your intellectual property. This is what differentiates you from everyone else. It doesn't have to be complicated, it's a checklist. 10 questions that assess the maturity of identity governance, productivity governance, and infrastructure governance. You'll use this framework in assessments. You'll publish it. You'll build your entire positioning around it. Publish your first 5 long-form pieces on architectural entropy and governance. These are LinkedIn articles, blog posts, Medium pieces. The titles are provocative. Why your cloud migration is creating more risk than it's solving. The hidden cost of unmanaged power platform flows. Identity drift, the invisible tax on your security budget. You're not writing tutorials. You're writing thought leadership. You're naming problems. You're offering frameworks. You're building authority. Identify 50 target companies with entropy signals. These are companies that have announced cloud initiatives, suffered breaches, or are facing regulatory pressure. You're going to reach out to them. You're going to start the outbound process. You're going to begin building your pipeline. Start personalized outbound outreach, 5 to 10 emails per week. These are not generic emails. These are personalized to the company's situation. You're referencing their specific entropy signal. You're asking a specific question. You're starting conversations. You're planting seeds. Months 3 and 4. Thought leadership and pipeline. Continue publishing content, 2 to 3 LinkedIn posts per week. Engage with other architects and security leaders. Comment on their posts. Build relationships. Share your case studies and frameworks. Make them specific enough to be useful, but abstract enough to be applicable across industries. Your outbound is generating responses now. You're getting discovery conversations. You're pitching assessments. Some are saying yes. You're closing your first assessment engagement. This is your proof of concept. This is your first case study. This is your first opportunity to prove that the framework works. Continue outbound outreach. You're now running a systematic process. Research companies, identify entropy signals, personalize emails, follow up. You're getting 2 to 4 discovery conversations per month. That's converting to 1 assessment engagement per month. You're building pipeline. Months 5 and 6. First assessment and remediation. Your first assessment is underway. You're in the client's environment. You're analyzing their control planes. You're identifying entropy. You're quantifying risk. You're building the report. This is where you prove your value. This is where you show that the framework works. You're also closing your second assessment. Your outbound is working. Your positioning is working. You're getting inbound inquiries now. People who've engaged with your content. People who understand the problem. People who are ready to buy. By the end of month 6, your first assessment is complete. You're presenting the report. The client is shocked. They didn't know they had this much entropy. They didn't know the risk was this high. They're ready to remediate. You're closing your first remediation engagement. This is $120,000 to $150,000. This is your first big deal. Months 7 through 9, remediation execution and pipeline building. Your first remediation is underway. You're deploying controls, you're training teams, you're building governance. This is the real work. This is where you prove that you can execute. This is where you build the case study that changes everything. Your outbound is still running. You're closing assessments. You're closing your second remediation. You're building pipeline. You're getting inbound leads now. People who've seen your content. People who've engaged with your framework. People who are ready to buy. By the end of month 9, your first remediation is complete. You're presenting the outcomes. Role assignments reduced by 85%. Privileged accounts brought under control. Compliance gaps closed. The client is impressed. They're ready for the advisory retainer. You're closing your first $10,000 per month retainer. Months 10 through 12, retainer and scaling. You've got your first retainer. You've got 2 remediation engagements in flight. You've got 3 to 4 assessments in your pipeline. You're generating consistent revenue. You're building a predictable business. Your thought leadership is paying dividends. You're getting inbound leads without prospecting. You're getting referrals from satisfied clients. You're getting speaking opportunities. You're getting media inquiries. You're becoming known as the architect of necessity in the Microsoft ecosystem. By the end of month 12, you've generated $100,000 to $150,000 in revenue. You've got 1 retainer. You've got 2 remediation engagements completed. You've got a pipeline of assessments. You're on track to hit $200,000 to $300,000 in year 2. This is the 12-month plan. This is how you move from commodity consultant to architect of necessity. This is how you build a business that generates consistent premium revenue. This is how you hit 100K plus. The real work. You now have the framework, you have the positioning, you have the pricing model, you have the client acquisition strategy. You know how to position yourself as an architect of necessity instead of a feature builder. You know how to price governance instead of projects. You know how to build a business around risk mitigation instead of hours. But here's what matters. This only works if you actually execute. If you stay positioned as a builder, if you compete on cost, if you give away discovery, nothing changes. The framework only works if you apply it. Start small, run 1 assessment, charge for it, get a risk report into a client's hands, see what happens, see how they react when you quantify the entropy they didn't know they had, see how fast they want to remediate once they understand the cost of inaction. That's when you'll understand that this isn't theory. This is how consulting actually works at the top level. The consultants making 100K plus aren't smarter than you. They're not better at coding or configuring. They're just positioned differently. They sell necessity, not features. And necessity always beats cost. If this episode helped you think differently about your consulting business, please leave a review wherever you're listening. Reviews tell us what resonates. They tell us what you want to hear more about. They help other architects find this conversation. If you want to share your own entropy story, discuss how you're repositioning your consulting practice, or suggest a future episode topic, connect with Mirko Peters on LinkedIn at M365Show. He reads every message. He's building this community of architects who understand that governance is where the premium revenue lives. Until next time, stop building features, start architecting control.